Hey guys, tonight we're traveling back to one of history's most devastating periods, where you'll discover how ordinary people survived extraordinary horror. Imagine yourself now, the scratchy wool of your homespun tunic against your skin, the perpetual smell of wood smoke and livestock hanging in the air, and the constant awareness that you're just one bad harvest away from starvation. This is your life as a medieval peasant, and spoiler alert, things are about to get much, much worse. In fact, there's a roughly 2 in 3 chance you won't survive what's coming. So enjoy those lice-ridden straw mattresses and turnip stews while you can. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know where you're watching from and what time it is there. Are you a night owl in Sydney or catching this with breakfast in London? Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You wake before dawn, as you do every day of your life. Your body aches from yesterday's labor, but there's no time to linger on the lumpy straw mattress you share with your siblings. The roosters are already announcing morning, and the Lord's fields won't plow themselves. Your cottage, a single room with dirt floors and a thatched roof, is already stirring as your mother stokes the central hearth fire. The smoke finds its way out through a hole in the roof, more or less. Your breakfast is a chunk of dark bread, and perhaps some thin porridge if the harvest has been good. Historians still argue whether the average medieval peasant actually ate better than modern fast food consumers. Less sugar and processing, more whole grains and seasonal vegetables. But what nobody debates is the monotony of it all. Hope you like barley, because it's barley for breakfast, barley for lunch, and surprise, barley for dinner too. You slip your feet into wooden clogs. Shoes are expensive luxuries you'll wear only to church, and head out to begin the day's labor. It's spring of 1347, though you don't think of years that way. You mark time by saints' days and seasons, by planting and harvest. This particular spring seems like any other, wet, muddy, and full of back-breaking work preparing fields. What you don't know yet is that far away, in distant ports, sailors are disembarking ships carrying more than spices and silks. A pestilence has begun its journey toward your village, one that will reshape the world you know. But for now, your concerns are immediate and eternal: the weather, the crops, the Lord's demands, and whether that nagging cough your youngest sister developed overnight is something to worry about. Your life follows the rhythm of the sun and seasons. You work from dawn until dusk, pausing only when the church bells ring to remind you to pray. These bells structure your day: matins, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, compline, though as a field worker, you likely observe only some of these prayer times. One quirky fact about medieval timekeeping: you experience floating hours, where an hour in summer is considerably longer than an hour in winter, as daylight periods were simply divided into 12 equal parts, regardless of actual duration. The church dominates not just your schedule, but your understanding of the world. When unusual weather destroys crops, it's God's punishment. When a child recovers from fever, it's a saint's intervention. Your world is enchanted, alive with supernatural forces, both divine and demonic. Angels and demons are as real to you as the Lord's tax collectors, and sometimes considerably more merciful. Community is everything in your world. You rarely travel more than 10 miles from your birthplace throughout your entire life. Your village is your universe, its inhabitants the entire cast of characters in your life story. Privacy is a concept that would seem bizarre to you. You sleep, eat, and often bathe, on the rare occasions you do, in the company of others. Even using the privy might be a communal activity. And forget about personal space. Your entire family likely sleeps together for warmth, along with any livestock fortunate enough to live indoors. Speaking of livestock, your animals are perhaps your most valuable possessions. A pig isn't just bacon in waiting. It's a crucial investment, a walking savings account. You know each of your animals personally, and their health is directly tied to your survival. Remember that time Willem from the next village over had his only cow die? His youngest 2 children didn't survive the winter. That's the razor's edge you live on. But it's not all misery and toil. Village life has its moments of joy. Tonight happens to be the eve of a saint's feast day, which means tomorrow will bring a rare break from labor, perhaps some special food, and most exciting of all, ale flowing more freely than usual. These celebrations punctuate the grinding routine of peasant life, providing crucial psychological relief and community bonding. You've been looking forward to this for weeks. A chance to hear the traveling friar, who supposedly knows stories from as far away as the Holy Land. As you trudge home in the fading light, your muscles aching from a day of planting, you pass the village church. The priest, one of the few literate people you know, is lighting candles inside. He nods as you pass, and you quicken your steps slightly. While the church is your spiritual home, the priest also represents authority, and authority in your experience rarely brings good news. Besides, you still owe a tithe from last month's meager earnings. Rumors reach your village slowly, like distant thunder before a storm. First, it's just odd whispers from a traveling peddler who passed through last market day. He spoke of empty villages to the south, of mass graves and people dropping dead within days of showing strange black swellings. You and your neighbors crossed yourselves and dismissed it as drunken exaggeration. After all, terrible things always happen elsewhere, to other people. But then, the merchant who buys your villages, doesn't show up for the seasonal trade. And the following Sunday, your priest includes mysterious prayers for protection against the great mortality, sweeping distant lands. This is when the first real trickle of fear begins to seep into daily life. My cousin's husband has a brother in London, whispers Agnes, as you both collect water from the village well. Says people there are dying faster than they can bury them. Says it's God's judgment for sin. You feel a chill despite the spring sunshine. London is less than 3 days' journey away, close enough to feel real, but still comfortingly distant. The following week, a royal proclamation is nailed to the church door. Most people can't read it, but the priest translates after Mass. Plague has reached England's shores. king commands prayers and fasting. More troubling is what isn't officially stated, the whispers that even nobles and bishops are dying. If God's chosen representatives aren't being spared, what hope do simple peasants have? You notice subtle changes in village behavior. People begin avoiding travelers. The jovial atmosphere of the tavern turns somber as men drink more heavily, but laugh less frequently. Old grievances between neighbors are suddenly set aside. No one wants to die with unresolved sins. Children are kept closer to home, which they find confusing since spring usually means more freedom to roam the fields and woods. My grandmother survived the Great Fever 50 years ago, boasts Willem, the village's oldest resident, though historians still argue whether any similar epidemic from that period approached the scale of what was coming. She said to stuff your nose with herbs and wash in vinegar, and never look a sick person in the eyes. That's how the disease jumps from their soul to yours. This bizarre claim is met with earnest nods. In a world without microscopes or germ theory, any explanation feels better than none. The priest begins holding special services, extending beyond the usual schedule. The church bells ring more frequently, calling people to prayer at odd hours. You attend faithfully, though farm work doesn't pause for panic. Spring planting must continue, plague or no plague. People will still need to eat. Your mother starts collecting specific herbs and plants on her rare free days. Rosemary, sage, and garlic hang in bunches from your cottage's low ceiling beams. The pungent smell is overwhelming in the enclosed space, but she insists it will purify the air. Bad air brings sickness, she explains, repeating ancient Galenic medical theory that will persist for centuries. These herbs will drive it away. You don't question her wisdom. Mothers have been keeping children alive through calamities since time immemorial. A fascinating fringe belief begins circulating that cats spread the disease. This, unfortunately, leads to a village-wide slaughter of felines, removing one of your best defenses against the real carriers, rats, and their fleas. The irony won't be apparent for about 500 years, but you do notice more bold rodents in the grain storage almost immediately, which adds worry about potential famine to your growing list of concerns. The lord of your manor, who typically only appears for tax collection or to adjudicate major disputes, suddenly shows up with his family. They're moving from their urban residence to this rural estate, servants and luxuries in tow. Fresh country air is healthier, you overhear the lady telling her children as they process past your field. Their fear, visible even through their finery, makes your own anxiety spike. If the wealthy and informed are fleeing cities, the danger must be truly imminent. Sleep becomes more difficult. You lie awake on your straw mattress, listening to your siblings' breathing, wondering which illnesses lurking in your village might actually be early signs of plague. Old Mabel's persistent cough, Thomas's feverish child, the mysterious death of the miller's apprentice last week, which everyone attributed to a fall. Ordinary illnesses that you previously accepted as life's inevitable hardships now carry sinister potential. Markets grow smaller as fewer traveling merchants make their rounds. This means certain goods, salt, metal tools, exotic medicines become scarce. Prices rise accordingly. Your family had been saving to replace your worn plow blade, but now that's impossible. You'll have to make do with the damaged one for another season, making your already difficult labor even harder. Prophets and doomsayers appear with increasing frequency. A wild-eyed man with matted hair and a voice hoarse from shouting arrives in the village square one afternoon. Repent. The end days are upon us. Christ comes on clouds of judgment. He screams, terrifying the children and unsettling even the adults. The priest eventually persuades him to move on, but his apocalyptic warnings linger in everyone's minds. Is this truly the end of the world, as foretold in Revelation? Despite growing fear, life maintains its essential patterns. You still rise before dawn. You still plant the fields. You still attend Mass. You still break bread with your family. But now, these routine actions carry a sense of desperate normalcy, like actors performing familiar roles, while the theater around them begins to burn. How long before the performance becomes impossible to maintain? The plague arrives on an otherwise unremarkable Tuesday. Later, you'll divide your life into before and after this moment, but at the time, it begins with something so ordinary you almost miss its significance. Widow Perkins doesn't come to draw water at her usual time. By evening, word spreads through the village that she's taken ill with a fever and strange swellings. By Friday, she's dead. By Sunday, so are her neighbor, her nephew who tended to her, and the priest who administered her last rites. The disease moves through your village like fire through dry straw. The initial shock quickly gives way to a terrible, methodical rhythm. Illness, suffering, death, burial. Then repeat, faster and faster, until individual tragedies blur into one continuous horror. The church bells that normally mark the hours now toll constantly for the dead, until, in a cruel irony, there aren't enough healthy people left to ring them. You wake one morning to find your 10-year-old sister burning with fever. By midday, you discover the telltale blackened swellings, buboes, though you don't know that term, in her armpits. Your mother weeps silently as she bathes the child's forehead with vinegar-soaked cloths. Your father has already dug 3 small graves this week for other children in the village. You wonder if he has the strength to dig another. The symptoms progress with terrifying predictability. First comes the headache and fever, then the painful swellings, typically in the lymph nodes of the neck, armpits, or groin. These buboes start roughly the size of an egg, but can grow as large as an apple. Some victims develop black spots across their skin from internal bleeding, the tokens that give the Black Death its name. But what will haunt your dreams for years is the smell, a distinctive, sickly sweet stench of rotting flesh that emanates from the victim while they're still alive. I've heard from a sailor that in Sicily, the plague killed everyone in some villages, whispers a neighbor when you encounter him on the path. Everyone. The thought of entire communities simply ceasing to exist is almost too enormous to comprehend. You find yourself calculating which households in your village are still healthy, which are sick, which are empty. Death transforms even the most sacred social customs. Bodies that would normally be washed, dressed, and mourned community are now buried hastily, sometimes several to a grave. The elaborate funeral rituals that have guided souls to the afterlife for generations are abbreviated or abandoned entirely. This practicality, born of necessity, feels like its own kind of sin. Will these hastily committed souls find their way to heaven without proper ceremony? The theological implications trouble you deeply. One of the most terrifying aspects of the plague is its apparently random selection of victims. The virtuous die alongside sinners. Children are taken as readily as elders. Wealth provides little protection, though the Lord's family fled again at the first sign of local infection. You've heard even nobles are dying in their countryside retreats. Historians still argue whether the psychological impact of this apparent randomness was as devastating as the disease itself, undermining the medieval belief in a divinely ordered universe where good behavior was rewarded and sin punished. Your village's population declines so rapidly that after 3 weeks, there aren't enough able bodies to harvest the crops. Fields that were carefully planted just months ago now stand neglected, the potential food left to rot or be eaten by birds. The looming threat of famine adds another layer of anxiety. Those who survive the immediate pestilence might still starve in the coming winter. With the priest dead and no replacement sent from the bishop's office, itself devastated by plague, religious services become improvised affairs. The village blacksmith, known for his strong voice and ability to recite portions of the Latin Mass from memory, leads Sunday prayers. It's not proper women shouldn't read scripture publicly, and only ordained priests should administer sacraments, but these are not proper times. God will surely understand the necessity. Strangest of all is how quickly the extraordinary becomes ordinary. The sight of death carts collecting bodies, once shocking, now barely interrupts your day. The perpetual smell of burning herbs and vinegar washing becomes background scent. The constant anxiety settles into a dull awareness that lives in your stomach like an unwelcome guest. Humans, it turns out, can adapt to almost anything, even the apocalypse. I've outlived 4 of my children and 2 wives, says old Willem one evening as a small group gathers around a rare fire. Food is too precious to waste on communal cooking now, but tonight someone has caught 2 rabbits, enough to make a thin stew for the survivors. Never thought I'd see worse than the Great Famine 30 years back. Shows what I know. He laughs, a dry sound like autumn leaves crackling underfoot. You look around at the hollow-eyed survivors, sharing this moment of warmth. Your sister recovered, one of the few to survive once symptoms appeared, though she remains weak and thin. Your father developed a small bubo on his neck, but miraculously, it burst and drained without killing him. Your mother shows no signs of illness at all. As for you, each morning you wake surprised to find yourself still breathing, still plague-free. Is it the garlic you chew daily, the prayers you whisper constantly, or just blind, undeserved luck? The plague has transformed your understanding of time. The future, once an infinite road stretching ahead, now extends only as far as the next sunrise. The past, just months ago, seems like a different life entirely. a half-remembered dream of normalcy. You exist entirely in the present, in the immediate concerns of survival, finding food, avoiding infection, managing grief, maintaining whatever fragments of humanity you can salvage from the wreckage. With the village physician dead, and the nearest university-trained doctor refusing to leave the relative safety of the walled town 20 miles away, medical care falls to those with folk knowledge passed down through generations. Your grandmother becomes invaluable, her previously dismissed old wives' tales suddenly the only guidance available. Her wrinkled hands prepare poultices and tinctures with surprising confidence amid the chaos. Swallow 3 cloves of garlic each morning, she instructs, crushing the pungent bulbs with a wooden pestle. Then bind a live frog to your buboes. It will draw out the poison. You dutifully follow her first recommendation, but balk at the second. Frogs are increasingly difficult to find anyway, as every pond and stream has been depleted by desperate villagers following similar advice. The range of attempted remedies grows more bizarre as the death toll rises. People consume crushed emeralds if they're wealthy, or drink dissolved clay tablets if they're not. Some cut open live pigeons and bind them to their sores. Others bathe in urine or vinegar. A few desperate souls even try consuming arsenic in tiny amounts, believing it will kill the disease without killing them, a calculation that proves fatally optimistic in several cases. Master Gregory in the next village survived by sitting between 2 large fires day and night, reports a traveler passing through. The heat drove the plague from his blood. This leads to an uncomfortable summer trend of creating sweat lodges in homes already stifling in the summer heat. Several elderly villagers die of heat, exhaustion, rather than plague, though the distinction provides little comfort to their families. One of the most common and surprisingly effective preventative measures involves pomanders, oranges studded with cloves, and other spices carried on one's person to purify the surrounding air. While they do nothing to affect the actual transmission of disease, the strong scents sometimes repel fleas, the plague's true vector, though nobody realizes this connection. You trade your only knife for a small sachet of dried roses, cloves, and lavender to hang around your neck. It smells pleasant, if nothing else, a small comfort in a world increasingly defined by the stench of death. A fringe medical theory gaining popularity suggests that plague is spread by looking at an infected person. Specifically, making eye contact allows the disease to jump from their soul to yours through the windows of the eyes. This leads to the unsettling practice of family members refusing to make eye contact with their sick loved ones, turning their faces away while feeding or tending to them. The psychological damage of dying without the comfort of a loved one's gaze adds another layer of cruelty to an already brutal death. I've heard bloodletting works, suggests a neighbor, showing the leech bites on his forearms, drawing out the bad humors. This treatment, rooted in legitimate medieval medical theory, at least has the endorsement of absent physicians, though in practice it often weakens already struggling patients. Still, bloodletting remains popular because it represents action in the face of helplessness Better to try something, anything, than passively await death. Your grandmother teaches the children to identify specific plants that might help. Feverfew for reducing temperature, comfrey for drawing out infection, willow bark for pain. These herbal remedies, while insufficient against the plague itself, do provide symptomatic relief. Historians still argue whether some traditional herbal approaches may have boosted general immunity or provided mild antibiotic effects that helped certain individuals survive secondary infections. Prayer becomes its own form of medicine. People create elaborate daily devotional regimens, 7 paternosters before breakfast, a recitation of Psalm 91, ironically known as the Plague Psalm, at noon, and constant fingering of rosary beads. These practices may not affect physical outcomes, but they provide crucial psychological structure and comfort. God helps those who help themselves, your grandmother reminds you. So we pray, but we also boil drinking water and burn disease-carrying clothes. A fascinating and disturbing trend emerges in your region: the appearance of flagellants. These are religious zealots who travel from village to village, publicly whipping themselves bloody to atone for humankind's sins, which they believe caused the plague. Their processions are both horrifying and mesmerizing. Dozens of half-naked people walking in formation, chanting mournfully while rhythmically flogging their backs with leather whips studded with metal. They draw crowds wherever they go, despite church authorities condemning the practice as heretical. They say in Florence, doctors wear bird-faced masks filled with herbs to purify the air they breathe, mentions a cloth merchant who somehow survived his dangerous travels. The image of beaked physicians is both comical and terrifying. Though you never see such a costume yourself, the concept of protective face coverings takes hold. People tie herb-stuffed cloths over their mouths and noses when attending the sick, a practice that occasionally helps by pure accident, creating a barrier against flea vectors. Most frightening are the growing whispers about more sinister cures. A traveling tinker suggests that Jews are poisoning wells, citing their lower death rates, likely due to ritual cleanliness practices and segregated living conditions, as evidence of guilt. Others blame witchcraft, pointing fingers at village women who live alone or possess unusual knowledge of herbs. You watch in horror as desperate fear transforms into dangerous superstition. 3 women from a neighboring village are drowned as suspected plague spreaders, their only crime being their survival while others died. Through all this medical chaos, one truth becomes apparent: nothing works reliably. Your family might consume the same preventatives and apply identical treatments, yet death takes some while sparing others with no discernible pattern. This randomness is perhaps the cruelest aspect of the plague. It undermines any sense that you have agency in your own survival. You might do everything right and still perish, or flagrantly ignore all precautions and somehow survive. And yet, amid the failed remedies and superstitious practices, people do survive, not because of their treatments, but often despite them. Your own sister's recovery seems miraculous given the plague's typical mortality rate. Was it the daily golden seal tea grandmother forced down her throat, saint's medallion placed under her pillow, or simply her youth and previously robust health giving her immune system the edge it needed. You'll never know for certain, and this ambiguity shapes how future generations will approach medicine, with a mixture of empirical observation and desperate hope, gradually building toward something resembling scientific understanding. With medical remedies proving unreliable at best and deadly at worst, spiritual interventions take center stage in village life. The church may stand empty without its priest, but faith intensifies in inverse proportion to earthly hope. Prayer becomes as routine as breathing, constant, desperate, and largely unconscious. You find yourself muttering appeals to saints while working the fields, while eating your meager meals, even while drifting off to sleep. Saint Sebastian and Saint Roch are specifically powerful against plague, declares Widow Cooper, who has somehow survived despite tending to 12 plague victims. Her cottage walls are covered with crude drawings of these saints, created with charcoal on any available surface. Sebastian, pierced with arrows, but surviving, and Roch, showing his plague bubo while a dog brings him bread, become familiar figures throughout the village as people copy her devotional art. Mass processions form spontaneously, winding through village streets and into the surrounding countryside. Participants carry candles, crosses, and relics borrowed from the church. They sing hymns and liturgical chants, their voices combining in a haunting chorus that echoes across the otherwise silent landscape. Barefoot penitents walk on deliberately sharp stones, their bloodied footprints marking the path, physical pain offered as spiritual currency to purchase divine mercy. A particularly interesting religious phenomenon emerges. The village collectively adopts Saint Gertrude of Nivelles as a special protector, though she had never been particularly venerated in your region before. Known as a protector against rats and mice, her connection to plague is entirely folk-driven rather than church-sanctioned. Historians still argue whether this spontaneous adoption of specific saints represented genuine spiritual evolution or simply psychological coping mechanisms during mass trauma. My cousin's village made a bargain with God, shares a traveler passing through. They promised to perform a passion play every 10 years if the plague would spare them. Such community vows become common, creating religious obligations that will bind villages for generations. Your own community pledges to build a plague chapel if survival rates improve, a promise that will strain economic resources during reconstruction, but which no one dares to break. Religious artifacts take on heightened significance. A splinter allegedly from the True Cross, previously a minor curiosity in your parish church, becomes the centerpiece of healing rituals. The sick are brought before it, their foreheads pressed against the ancient wood, while family members recite specific prayer sequences. Whether through faith, coincidence, or the statistical inevitability that some plague victims will recover regardless of treatment, occasional healings occur, each one meticulously documented and repeated as evidence of divine intervention. Prayer routines grow increasingly elaborate and specific. Monday devotions must be directed to the Virgin Mary, Tuesdays to the Holy Trinity, Wednesdays to Saint Michael, and so forth. Prayers must be recited in particular positions, kneeling on bare stone for petitions regarding the sick, standing with arms outstretched for protection of the healthy. These complex spiritual algorithms reflect a desperate attempt to discover the correct combination that might unlock divine mercy. We must have sinned grievously for God to punish us so. The blacksmith sermonizes during one of his makeshift Sunday services. This theological interpretation, plague as divine punishment, is both terrifying and oddly comforting. Terrifying because it suggests an angry deity deliberately inflicting suffering. Comforting because it implies human agency. If sin caused the plague, perhaps virtue can end it. You examine your conscience meticulously, confessing even minor transgressions aloud in church, as there's no priest to hear private confessions. Dreams and visions take on prophetic significance. When young Alice, the miller's daughter, reports dreaming of the Virgin Mary pointing to the village well, crowds gather to draw water from it, believing it suddenly imbued with healing properties. When old Willem sees a ring around the moon, complex interpretations emerge about its meaning for plague progression. The line between spirituality and superstition blurs, but the distinction hardly matters to people grasping for any form of hope. Quirky but widespread practice develops involving religious graffiti. Using knives or charcoal, people carve or draw crusader crosses on doorposts and window frames, often accompanied by the letters C plus M plus B, standing for Christus Mansionum Benedicat. May Christ bless this house. These amateur protective markings appear everywhere, from grand manors to humble pig pens, a visual testament to universal fear transcending social boundaries. Most poignant are the personal bargains struck with God. I promised to never eat meat again if my daughter recovers, whispers Agnes at the well. I vowed to walk barefoot to Canterbury if my sons survive, confides another neighbor. These private covenants create a spiritual economy of sacrifice and potential reward, giving people a sense of control in uncontrollable circumstances. And when loved ones die, despite these promised exchanges, faith is tested, sometimes broken, occasionally transformed into something deeper and more complex than before. Through it all, the absence of church authority creates space for theological innovation. Without priests to enforce orthodoxy, folk interpretations of Christian doctrine flourish, some verging on heresy. People begin practicing communion at home, using ordinary bread when consecrated hosts are unavailable. Lay people perform emergency baptisms, not just for dying infants, always permitted, but for adults seeking spiritual protection. The line between clergy and laity, previously sharp and inviolable, begins to blur, launching theological questions that will echo through coming centuries. Your own prayers evolve during this time. The rote recitations taught since childhood give way to raw, unstructured conversations with God. You bargain, plead, sometimes rage against divine indifference. Why her and not me? You ask when a neighbor's virtuous daughter dies, while the reportedly promiscuous tavern server remains healthy. What lesson are we meant to learn from such random cruelty? These questions, multiplied across thousands of villages and millions of survivors, will ultimately help reshape European spirituality in the plague's aftermath. The plague transforms not just bodies and spirits, but the very structure of family life. Your household, once organized according to strict medieval hierarchies, adapts into something more fluid as necessity overrides tradition. When your father falls ill, your mother assumes leadership without discussion or ceremony. When she needs to gather herbs from the forest, you barely into adulthood become temporary head of household. Roles shift like quicksilver as the family unit fights for collective survival. "We sleep in shifts now," explains your neighbor Thomas, dark circles beneath his eyes. Someone must always be awake to watch for symptoms. This practice spreads throughout the village, families assigning night watchmen to monitor sleeping members, ready to isolate anyone showing early signs of fever. Your own family adopts this approach after your sister's recovery, rotating responsibility between all members old enough to recognize plague symptoms. Sleep becomes fragmented, adding exhaustion to the already heavy burden of constant anxiety. Family separation becomes both necessary and heartbreaking. When 10-year-old William from the mill shows signs of plague, his parents make the excruciating decision to move him into the barn, where his mother tends him from a distance, using a long wooden paddle to push food and water within his reach. "Better to risk one child than lose all 5, his father explains, voice cracking. You wonder if you would have the strength to make the same choice. Fascinating changes occur in family hygiene practices. Households that previously shared everything, eating utensils, washing water, sleeping pallets, begin maintaining individual items. Your own family now marks wooden cups with distinct notches to prevent accidental sharing. Communal meals continue, but gone is the medieval practice of multiple people eating from the same trencher or drinking from the same cup. Historians still argue whether these instinctive distancing measures meaningfully reduced transmission or merely provided psychological comfort. "My husband burns juniper branches at our threshold each evening," shares Agnes, describing one of the countless family protection rituals that emerge. "Then we all walk through the smoke before entering for the night." Such practices blend medical theories about purifying air with spiritual cleansing rituals. Your own family develops an elaborate bedtime routine involving hanging fresh herbs, sprinkling blessed water in corners, and reciting specific prayers in unison. A comforting ritual that bonds you together even as the world disintegrates. Perhaps most remarkable is how the plague reconfigures emotional hierarchies within families. Medieval parenting typically maintained emotional distance. High child mortality rates historically discouraged too much attachment. Yet now, witnessing the village's children dying in extraordinary numbers triggers profound shifts. Mothers openly weep for sick children. Fathers abandon work to sit beside feverish sons. Siblings risk infection to comfort each other. The stoicism expected in ordinary childhood illness gives way to raw, desperate love. I never told my children I loved them before, confesses a weather-beaten farmer whose wife and 2 daughters succumbed within days of each other. Always thought they just knew it. Now, I tell my remaining son every morning and night. This new emotional expressiveness, born from trauma and grief, will persist long after the plague recedes, subtly altering family dynamics for generations to come. Inheritance patterns undergo rapid, unplanned transformation. Your cousin's family provides a stark example. Within 1 month, a chain of deaths makes the youngest son, previously destined for apprenticeship to a blacksmith, the sole heir to the family's substantial landholdings. Across Europe, similar reshuffling of wealth and property occurs at unprecedented rates. Children find themselves orphaned, but suddenly land rich. Distant relatives inherit properties they've never seen. Family lines consolidate or disappear entirely within weeks. A quirky but widespread adaptation involves family-specific protection recipes. Each household develops its unique plague preventative, a special combination of herbs, specific prayers, particular behaviors, often kept jealously secret from neighbors. Mother won't even tell me what she puts in the protection pouches she sews into our clothes, whispers your friend during a rare moment of socializing by the village well. Says if too many know, the power diminishes. These family secrets will become treasured traditions, passed through generations, long after their original purpose fades from memory. Meal preparation evolves as families attempt to boost immunity through diet. Your mother insists that everyone consume garlic daily and increases the use of specific herbs believed to fight infection: sage, rosemary, thyme. Meals become more deliberately medicinal than pleasurable, though food scarcity means you're grateful for anything that fills your stomach. One unexpected outcome: children normally resistant to strong-flavored foods now consume them without complaint, understanding on some instinctive level that these unpleasant tastes might keep them alive. Most painful are the transformed death rituals. Medieval culture elaborately structured the process of dying and mourning, with specific prayers, washing ceremonies, wake periods, and funeral processions. Now, with deaths occurring too rapidly for traditional observances, families improvise abbreviated rituals. Your neighbor Marie sings her husband's favorite hymn as his sole funeral service before his hasty burial. Another family places treasured objects in the grave, since there's no time for proper preparation of the body. Family record-keeping takes on new urgency. Your father, barely literate, begins marking deaths on the wall of your cottage, simple notches that create a grim calendar of loss. Other families write names on parchment scraps or carve them into wooden beams. Someone must remember, insists your grandmother. Someone must be able to tell the story when this is over. This desperate preservation of memory, ensuring that loved ones aren't just statistics in mass graves, represents a profound form of resistance against the plague's dehumanizing scale. As the plague ravages your community, traditional food sources become unreliable. Fields lie untended as farm workers succumb to disease or prioritize caring for sick relatives. Market days are suspended to prevent contagion. Supply chains collapse as neighboring villages enforce strict isolation. Faced with these challenges, your survival increasingly depends on nature's overlooked bounty. The wild foods that medieval peasants have always known about, but generally considered inferior to cultivated crops. My grandfather showed me which tree bark can be ground into flour during the famine of his youth. Your mother explains, stripping the inner cambium layer from a pine tree. You watch skeptically as she dries it beside the hearth before pulverizing it between stones. The resulting flour is bitter and resinous, but mixed with your dwindling barley supplies, it extends your bread enough for several more meals. Such knowledge, passed through generations, but rarely needed in good times, suddenly becomes essential for survival. Foraging expeditions become daily necessities rather than occasional supplements. You learn to identify dozens of edible plants previously ignored. Dandelion greens, whose bitter leaves make palatable salad when soaked in salt water. Burdock root, starchy and filling when properly cleaned and roasted. Chickweed, purslane, and lamb's quarters, all providing vital nutrition despite their status as weeds. Most valuable are mushrooms, though gathering them requires careful knowledge. The difference between varieties can mean sustenance or agonizing death. Acorns saved my family during the last famine, shares a neighbor who has, remarkably, kept his entire household plague-free through rigorous isolation. He demonstrates the labor-intensive process: collecting, shelling, grinding, and most importantly, leaching the bitter tannins through repeated water soakings. The resulting acorn flour lacks the rising properties of wheat, but produces dense, nutritious cakes that quell hunger pangs. You spend entire days processing acorns, your hands stained brown from the work. Historians still argue whether the widespread adoption of wild food gathering during plague years represented a temporary emergency measure or signified deeper cultural shifts in food perception. What's certain is that your relationship with the land transforms the forest. Previously viewed primarily as a source of building materials and fuel, reveals itself as a complex food system that requires neither plowing nor planting. Perhaps the most valuable wild resource proves to be medicinal plants. Your grandmother's knowledge, supplemented by a dog-eared collection of herbal wisdom passed through generations, guides your daily gathering. Elderberry to boost immunity, willow bark for fever, yarrow for wounds. These remedies can't cure plague, but they address the myriad other ailments that continue afflicting your community, illnesses that might prove fatal without basic treatment, especially in bodies weakened by malnutrition and stress. A quirky but widespread food preservation technique emerges from necessity. With salt supplies dwindling and vinegar stocks depleted, villages turn to fermentation. Cabbages, turnips, and other vegetables are shredded, packed into crocks with minimal salt, and allowed to ferment naturally. The resulting preserved foods, early versions of sauerkraut, provide crucial vitamin C during winter months, inadvertently protecting survivors from scurvy. Your family's fermenting crock becomes a prized possession, guarded as carefully as your few silver coins. The Lord's orchards go unharvested, observes your father one evening. The fruit rots on the trees while we subsist on gruel. This observation leads to moral recalibration regarding property. Traditionally, taking produce from the Lord's lands would constitute stealing a serious crime. But with manor administration in chaos and food growing scarce, such distinctions blur. Under cover of darkness, your family joins others in harvesting apples, pears, and plums from untended orchards, justifying the action through necessity, while still offering prayers of contrition. Water sources require new consideration during plague times. Village wells, typically social gathering points, now represent potential contamination sites. Your family begins collecting rainwater in barrels and boiling all drinking water as a precaution, a practice rooted in spiritual purification, but accidentally providing genuine health benefits. You develop a rotation system for fetching water, minimizing exposure by sending only one family member at odd hours when the well area is deserted. Food preparation rituals intensify as cooking becomes increasingly medicinal. Every meal includes at least one ingredient chosen specifically for health properties. Garlic, onions, and strongly flavored herbs dominate your diet. Food is your first medicine, your grandmother insists, carefully adding specific proportions of dried herbs to the evening pottage. These culinary adaptations will influence regional cooking long after plague years end, with certain flavor combinations becoming cultural standards rather than medicinal necessities. Storage techniques evolve under pressure of uncertain futures. You dig new root cellars, deeper than traditional storage pits, creating cool spaces where turnips, carrots, and beets might last through winter. Nuts are buried in sand to prevent rancidity. Mushrooms are strung on threads and dried above the hearth. Every available container is repurposed for food storage. Empty medicine vials hold precious herbs. Cracked pottery stores dried berries. Even hollow reeds become vessels for seeds. Your cottage transforms into something resembling a squirrel's winter cache. Most remarkable is how quickly children adapt to these dietary changes. Young ones who previously complained about eating turnips now willingly consume bitter greens and acorn bread without protest. You watch your younger brother identifying edible plants with the same precision he once applied to spotting birds' nests or tracking rabbits. This generation will grow up with fundamentally different food knowledge than their parents, more flexible, less dependent on cultivated staples, intimately connected to the untamed edges of the landscape. Remember those potatoes mentioned in your lesson title? Well, there's a historical twist there. Potatoes didn't actually arrive in Europe until the late 16th century long after the initial Black Death pandemic of the 1340s. This represents one of history's great what-ifs. Had potatoes been available during plague years, their growth pattern underground, individually harvested as needed, requiring minimal tending, would have been ideally suited to pandemic conditions. Their high nutritional value and excellent storage properties might have significantly reduced plague-associated famine. But medieval peasants would need to wait another 2 centuries for this resilient tuber to revolutionize European food security. For now, you rely on knowledge of local ecosystems, identifying which lakeshores harbor cattail roots, which forest edges offer hazelnuts, which meadows produce the sweetest berries. This intimate environmental knowledge, paired with preservation techniques refined through desperate necessity, creates a food security system parallel to traditional agriculture, one that proves surprisingly resilient in the face of catastrophic social disruption. When you eventually return to more normal agricultural patterns, these wild food practices won't be abandoned, but integrated, creating a more diverse and resilient food culture than existed before the plague. As weeks of plague stretch into months, your village undergoes profound social transformation. The initial crisis response, characterized by heightened cooperation and shared purpose, gives way to more complex dynamics. New divisions emerge even as older social boundaries dissolve. The community that survives will bear little resemblance to the one that existed before pestilence arrived. We should burn the miller's cottage, argues a red-faced farmer at an impromptu village assembly. Everyone who's lived there has died of plague. The building itself must be contaminated. Others nod in agreement, fear overriding respect for property that would have been unthinkable months earlier. This suggests a traumatic but fascinating evolution in medieval understanding of disease transmission, a crude recognition of contamination that, while missing the actual mechanism of fleas and rats, intuitively grasps that plague lingers in physical environments. Social hierarchies undergo dramatic revision. With the lord's family fled, the priest dead, and many prominent villagers succumb to disease, leadership emerges from unexpected quarters. The blacksmith's widow, previously notable only for her exceptional bread making, reveals organizational skills that make her the de facto village administrator. A shepherd boy with unexplained immunity becomes valued for his ability to tend the sick without falling ill himself. Your own grandmother, once dismissed as merely the herb woman, now commands respect bordering on reverence for her medical knowledge. My family has buried 3 people while yours remains untouched, accuses a grieving father, confronting your father at the well. What secret protection have you hidden from us? Such suspicions spark dangerous tensions. Families with lower mortality rates face increasing hostility from less fortunate neighbors. These conflicts occasionally turn violent. You hear whispers of a mob attacking a prosperous household in a neighboring village, convinced their survival indicated witchcraft or secret preventative measures withheld from the community. Religion provides both unity and division. The makeshift services led by the blacksmith initially brought comfort through familiar rituals, but theological disagreements emerge as the crisis drags on. Some villagers embrace increasingly apocalyptic interpretations, while others develop more personal, mystical approaches to faith. God speaks directly to my heart now, declares Agnes, who claims to have visions during prayer. We need no priests as intermediaries. Such statements would have been dangerously heretical months ago. Now, they merely spark heated discussion at community gatherings. Historians still argue whether plague years accelerated existing trends toward religious individualism or created entirely new spiritual paradigms. What's clear in your village is that religious certainty has fractured. Even as collective rituals continue, personal interpretations proliferate. The unified medieval worldview, where everyone understood reality through the same religious framework, begins showing significant cracks that will widen in coming decades. Property boundaries undergo both literal and figurative renegotiation. With numerous households left empty by death, practical questions arise about land use and inheritance. The cooper's fields lie fallow while we have strength to work them, but insufficient land of our own, argues a landless laborer whose family survived intact. Surely, we should cultivate their land for the common good until heirs are located. Such pragmatic redistributions occur throughout the village, creating de facto land reforms that would have been unthinkable before the plague. A quirky but widespread phenomenon emerges in plague-affected communities: the formation of survival households, combining previously unrelated families. When the plague takes all adults from one household, but spares the children, and meanwhile takes all children, but spares adults from another, the survivors naturally combine resources and living arrangements. Your own cousin moves into your cottage after her parents succumb, bringing her family's cow and remaining grain supplies. These blended households create new kinship networks that defy traditional family structures. Trade relationships transform dramatically. The closed economy enforced by plague quarantines means your village must become largely self-sufficient. Craftspeople adapt their production to community needs rather than external markets. The village potter, who previously created fine tableware for urban customers, now produces simple storage containers for preserved foods. The weaver abandons decorative work to focus on durable clothing. This inward economic focus strengthens internal community bonds while weakening connections to the outside world. We should post guards at the village boundaries, suggests Thomas, whose family has remained remarkably healthy. Turn away all travelers who might bring fresh contagion. This proposal sparks heated debate about isolation versus necessary contact with the wider world. After passionate arguments, the village implements a compromise. Travelers may bring goods, but must leave them at a designated field edge for collection after they depart. This practice of contactless trade emerges independently in communities across Europe, a medieval version of quarantine procedures that will evolve into formal public health measures in later centuries. Perhaps most fascinating is how plague reshapes concepts of social responsibility. Medieval village life always involved mutual assistance during crises, but plague conditions amplify these traditions. Families with surplus regularly share food with those who cannot work due to illness. Households that lose parents find their orphaned children distributed among surviving families without formal arrangement. When old Willem's cottage roof collapses, unmarried men from 3 families repair it without being asked, despite having no kinship obligation to the elderly widower. Yet alongside this heightened cooperation, new forms of social exclusion develop. Families who have suffered plague cases find themselves subtly ostracized even after recovery. People cross the street to avoid those who have tended the sick. Some households refuse to accept communal food if they cannot verify who prepared it. These reactions, perhaps instinctive disease avoidance mechanisms, create painful divisions in a community already fragmented by loss. "We should leave this place entirely," a young couple announces during a community meeting. "Start fresh somewhere the plague hasn't touched." This radical proposal finds surprising support, particularly among younger villagers with fewer ties to ancestral lands. For the first time in generations, geographic mobility becomes a serious consideration. Some families do depart, seeking rumored plague-free regions, or simply fleeing unbearable memories. Others double down on attachment to place, insisting that abandoning ancestral lands would dishonor the dead and invite further divine punishment. The plague's most profound social impact may be its effect on collective memory and identity. "We are the people who survived" becomes an unspoken but powerful defining characteristic of your community. Every family has its plague story: who was lost, who recovered, what desperate measures proved necessary for survival. These shared traumas create bonds that transcend previous social categories. When you meet someone from your village decades later, you'll recognize each other not just as neighbors, but as fellow survivors of an apocalypse, members of a generation marked forever by experiences outsiders cannot fully comprehend. As plague months stretch toward a full year, patterns emerge among survivors that defy simple explanation. Your village's population has diminished by nearly 2/3, a devastating loss mirrored across Europe. Yet who lives and who dies often seems arbitrary. This randomness proves perhaps the most psychologically challenging aspect of the entire catastrophe, undermining medieval beliefs about divine order and moral causality. "You've broken every commandment worth breaking," confesses the tavern keeper, one of the few buildings still operating as villagers seek liquid comfort in unprecedented quantities. "By rights, I should have been the first to die. Yet here I stand while the priest lies cold." He crosses himself, genuinely bewildered by his survival. His experience contradicts the prevailing belief that plague represents divine punishment for sin, a theological problem that will trouble survivors for generations. Medical observations accumulate through bitter experience. Children seem to survive at higher rates than adults, though infants remain vulnerable. The elderly perish almost universally once infected. Men appear slightly more susceptible than women, though pregnant women show alarming mortality rates. These demographic patterns will reshape European population structures for centuries, creating labor shortages that ultimately improve peasant bargaining power, while simultaneously opening unusual economic opportunities for surviving women. My whole family fell ill, but only I recovered, recounts a hollow-eyed young woman who now lives alone in a cottage built for 8. Conversely, in other households, only one member succumbs, while everyone else remains mysteriously untouched despite intimate contact with the sick. These inexplicable variations fuel both religious interpretations, divine selection for unknowable purposes, and emerging proto-scientific theories about individual resistance to disease. Historians still argue whether genetic factors played a significant role in plague survival. Modern research suggests that certain genetic variations providing resistance to HIV may have evolved in response to plague exposure, indicating that some survival patterns might indeed have biological bases. But for you and your medieval contemporaries, such scientific explanations lie centuries in the future. Instead, you observe outcomes and construct narratives that make sense within your worldview, searching for patterns in what might be largely random survival. A fascinating fringe theory gains traction in your region, that occupational exposure to strong smells provides protection. The tanner, who works daily with pungent chemicals treating animal hides, survives despite his entire family perishing. The family that produces strong-smelling cheese similarly avoids infection. While the actual mechanism might involve these trades keeping rats and fleas at bay rather than any protective quality of the smells themselves, the observation leads to increased popularity of heavily aromatic activities and products. I was bitten by a mad dog as a child, offers Old Willem, attempting to explain his surprising survival at an age when most elders quickly succumbed. Nearly died of the fever then. Perhaps it hardened my blood against this new pestilence. Such personal theories about acquired immunity proliferate, with survivors attributing their good fortune to previous illnesses, unusual dietary habits, or specific preventative practices. Some of these folk theories contain accidental wisdom. People who survived childhood diseases often did have generally stronger immune systems. Geographic patterns of survival emerge that will puzzle scholars for centuries. Certain villages are decimated, while others just miles away face significantly lower mortality. Some regions of Europe suffer catastrophic 80% population loss, while others manage with merely 30% reduction. These variations likely relate to complex factors, including rat population density, trade patterns, and implementation of primitive quarantine measures. But to medieval observers, they suggest divine favor or punishment targeting specific communities for unknowable reasons. My brother in the mountains writes that they've seen no plague there at all, reports a traveling peddler brave or desperate enough to continue his rounds. This observation, that plague affects lowland populations more severely than highland ones, is broadly accurate and represents an important epidemiological clue about transmission vectors. Some families with means begin seasonal migration to higher elevations during summer months when plague spreads most rapidly, an adaptation that will evolve into the aristocratic practice of retreating to summer homes during fever season. One of the most reliable predictors of survival proves to be social isolation, not just from the visibly sick, but from society generally. Hermits living at forest edges, shepherds tending flocks in remote pastures, charcoal burners working alone in woods. These solitary figures survive at disproportionate rates. Your own family's decision to minimize contact with neighbors, though psychologically difficult, likely contributed to your above-average survival. This lesson that isolation protects during epidemics will eventually evolve into formal quarantine procedures. Quirky but widespread observation emerges regarding animals. Some species seem to anticipate plague outbreaks. The rats disappeared a week before the first human case, recalls Thomas, noting a pattern recognized across many communities. And now, as rat populations return, human cases decline. This connection between rodent and human disease represents a crucial epidemiological insight, though the complete transmission cycle involving fleas will remain unidentified for centuries. Still, many villages adopt rat watching as an early warning system for potential new outbreaks. Most troubling for medieval religious sensibilities is the apparent ineffectiveness of piety as protection. The bishop processed through the cathedral with the holy relics, then died 3 days later, reports a merchant who witnessed events in the nearest city. Similarly, monastery populations, despite their isolation, regular washing rituals, and constant prayer suffer devastation comparable to secular communities. These outcomes challenge fundamental assumptions about divine protection earned through devotion, contributing to subtle but profound shifts in religious thinking. For many survivors, the psychological impact of arbitrary survival proves as difficult as the physical threat of disease. Why was I spared when better people perished? Becomes a haunting question, generating survivors' guilt that manifests in increased religious donations, charitable works, and sometimes self-destructive behaviors. Your own family establishes a yearly charitable feast on the anniversary of your sister's recovery, feeding any poor travelers who pass through, a tradition of gratitude that will continue for generations. Through all these observations and theories runs a common thread: the recognition that survival often depends more on luck than virtue, more on circumstance than character. This realization fundamentally challenges medieval worldviews predicated on cosmic order and divine justice. The arbitrary nature of plague mortality plants seeds of doubt that will eventually flower into more secular, scientific understandings of the world. Though for now, most survivors incorporate the randomness into ever more complex religious interpretations, rather than abandoning faith entirely. As plague finally begins receding from your region, leaving empty cottages and untended fields in its wake, survivors take inventory not just of material losses, but of accumulated knowledge. You've learned which measures seem to help isolation, cleanliness, certain herbs, and which prove useless or harmful. This practical wisdom, earned through devastating experience, will inform responses to future outbreaks. More profoundly, you've learned that catastrophe rarely follows moral rules, that survival often depends on factors beyond individual control, a humbling lesson that tempers medieval certainty with new humility about humanity's place in the natural order. The plague doesn't end with dramatic finality, but gradually releases its grip on your community. New cases become less frequent, weeks pass without deaths, and slowly, tentatively, life begins reorganizing itself around the absence of the dead and the needs of survivors. Your village has lost nearly 2/3 of its population, a demographic catastrophe mirrored across Europe. Yet remarkably, human resilience asserts itself even amid unprecedented devastation. The fields need planting regardless of who remains to harvest, states your father with simple pragmatism at the first community assembly held without fear of contagion. This sentiment, that life's fundamental patterns must continue despite tragedy, guides the initial recovery. You join neighbors in the monumental task of returning abandoned fields to cultivation, working land that may legally belong to the dead, but practically requires tending for community survival. Property redistribution occurs with surprising speed and minimal conflict. With so many complete family lines extinguished, inheritance becomes complicated, sometimes impossible to determine. My cousin's wife's brother was the last male in their line, explains Thomas, now cultivating their substantial holdings. If their distant kin ever return from the north to claim these fields, I'll relinquish them. Until then, the land needs working. These practical arrangements, born of necessity, eventually receive formal recognition as manor courts resume operation, creating new property patterns that persist for generations. Labor takes on unprecedented value in this depopulated landscape. Before the plague, peasant labor was abundant and cheap. Now it becomes scarce and increasingly expensive. I'll only help with your harvest if you give me a quarter share. You overhear a landless laborer negotiating with a property owner who previously would have paid a pittance for the same work. This shift in economic leverage gradually improves living standards for surviving working people, accelerating the decline of feudal labor systems that had defined medieval life for centuries. Marriage patterns transform dramatically in plague's aftermath. With so many widows and widowers, remarriage becomes commonplace, creating blended families that merge orphaned children, surviving livestock, and inherited properties. Age differences in couples increase as survivors pragmatically seek partners regardless of previously important considerations like comparable social status or age. Your own uncle, a middle-aged widower, marries a woman barely 20, while the elderly widow Cooper takes a husband 15 years her junior. Arrangements that raise eyebrows but meet crucial practical needs for household management. We should rebuild the church before reconstructing the manor house, argues the blacksmith at a community meeting, signaling subtle shifts in village power dynamics. With the Lord still absent and unlikely to return, rumors suggest the entire noble family perished at their city residence. Traditional authority structures remain weakened. Village self-governance strengthens through necessity, establishing new patterns of communal decision-making that will persist even after formal feudal authority eventually reasserts itself. A fascinating trend emerges in craft specialization and technology adoption. With fewer people available for all necessary tasks, labor-saving innovations gain new importance. Your village invests collectively in an improved mill design that requires fewer operators. The blacksmith experiments with better plow designs that maximize the work of draft animals when human hands are scarce. Historians still argue whether the plague created significant technological acceleration by necessitating efficiency improvements, or primarily caused knowledge loss through death of skilled practitioners. The reality likely includes both effects, varying by region and skill domain. Psychological recovery proceeds unevenly alongside material reconstruction. I still can't sleep through the night, confesses Agnes at the well, 18 months after the plague's peak. I dream of the dying and wake listening for the death cart's wheels. These trauma symptoms, what modern people would identify as post-traumatic stress, affect many survivors. Yet, alongside this psychological burden emerges a curious form of resilience. Having survived apocalyptic conditions, ordinary hardships seem less overwhelming. When summer storms damage crops the following year, the community responds with calm determination rather than despair. Religious practices both intensify and transform in plague's aftermath. Commitment to devotional routines remains strong. The newly rebuilt church fills for services, and religious processions continue regularly. Yet subtle theological shifts occur in how people understand divine will and intervention. God helps those who protect themselves becomes a common saying, reflecting a more active approach to disease prevention rather than passive acceptance of divine punishment. This recalibration between human agency and divine will represent an important evolution in medieval religious thinking. A quirky but widespread phenomenon emerges in post-plague art and architecture. Across Europe, memento mori, remember death, themes proliferate in cultural production. When your village finally commissions new decorations for the rebuilt church, they include vivid imagery of skeletons, death figures, and the dance of death, artistic reminders of mortality's inevitability. Far from morbid in context, these images offer survivors a framework for understanding their experiences and integrating them into a coherent worldview. Death becomes less a terrifying unknown and more a familiar companion walking alongside the living. Most significant, perhaps, are the subtle but profound shifts in how communities understand themselves and their place in the world. We survived what couldn't be survived, your father remarks one evening by the fire, expressing a sentiment common among plague survivors. This shared experience of enduring catastrophic loss creates both fatalism about life's uncertainties and fierce determination to extract meaning and joy from whatever time remains. Communities rebuild not just physically, but philosophically, gradually constructing new narratives that incorporate the plague experience into collective identity. For children born after the plague, the world before exists only in stories. Your youngest sister, born 2 years after the peak of mortality, listens wide-eyed to accounts of crowded village festivals and fields full of workers that now sound like fantastic tales. These post-plague generations grow up in a world of relative opportunity, more land available, better wages for labor, increased social mobility, while simultaneously inheriting survivor narratives that emphasize life's fragility and the importance of preparation for future disasters. The final integration of plague experience into medieval culture comes through the development of public health measures. Your village, like many across Europe, establishes protocols for future disease outbreaks, designated quarantine buildings, systems for supporting isolated households without direct contact, procedures for disposing of contaminated materials. These practical adaptations, refined and formalized over subsequent generations, eventually evolve into Europe's first public health systems, institutional acknowledgement that communities must actively manage disease rather than merely endure it. As we bring our journey through medieval plague survival to close, it's worth noting that the world that emerged from the Black Death shadow was fundamentally transformed. The plague killed approximate 1/3 of Europe's population, as many as 50 million people. Yet from this devastation arose significant social reorganization that many historians consider pivotal in transitioning medieval Europe toward early modern society. Labor shortages improved peasant bargaining power, accelerating the decline of feudalism. Religious authority faced new questioning that would eventually contribute to Reformation movements. Medical practice began its slow evolution from purely theoretical to more observational approaches. Your story as a peasant survivor of plague-era Europe is part of this larger historical transformation. Through a combination of practical knowledge, community adaptation, and yes, substantial luck, you survived history's most infamous pandemic. The world you rebuild will never be identical to what existed before. The dead cannot be replaced. Certain knowledge has been lost. Psychological scars will remain. Yet human resilience ensures that life continues, communities reconstruct themselves, and civilization persists despite unimaginable challenges. Tonight, as you drift toward sleep, remember that while medieval peasants didn't have modern medicine or scientific understanding to battle the Black Death, they marshaled remarkable resources: community cohesion, practical adaptability, herbal knowledge accumulated through generations, and psychological resilience we can still admire centuries later. Their experience reminds us that human societies possess profound capacity for survival and rebuilding, even when facing history's most devastating challenges. The thread connecting their world to ours remains unbroken, woven through centuries of human experience, allowing us to learn from their struggles and triumphs across the vast distance of time. Sleep well, knowing that if medieval peasants could survive their plague years through a combination of folk wisdom, community support, and sheer determination, perhaps we too can face whatever challenges await in our own uncertain futures.